Yep, you're good.
Okay. So as I said before, my name is Drew. I work on our web predictability effort. If you want to find me on email, it's dknox@google or chromium.org. So I've been working with Rick and a lot of people in this room for the last year and a half or so on some of these project areas. So today I wanted to just go into a few different points. One is sort of what we're aiming for in the long term, kind of how we see if everything worked out, if we achieved all our goals, where would we be, or where we hope to be. Then talk about some of our structure for how we think we're going to get to some of those long-term goals, or how we'd like to get to those long-term goals. Then talk about where we think we are now, what we're focusing on, and what projects we're working on in that space. So again, at any point, feel free to interrupt, to ask questions. I'm happy to pause and discuss any of these pieces. All right, so our long-term vision is sort of, obviously part of this is very ambitious, but our goal is, one, that you'll never have to do UA sniffing again, right? You may have different sets of capabilities within browsers, but there's no interoperability differences within any given set of APIs. So I think this is a somewhat important distinction, right? We don't want to get to a point where, no browser ever feels comfortable experimenting with a new API, right? Browsers should still feel comfortable moving ahead. But as second, third, fourth implementations come along, we want those to be interoperable and for that to be accomplished sort of automatically. Also, generally, over time, we want any API to trend towards either being everywhere or being nowhere. And there may be some exceptions to this rule, right? There may be some platform-specific APIs or things like that. But generally, if you look sort of asymptotically, we would want us to always be moving in the same direction. And finally, this one is more compat than interop, but we want it to be that whenever we make a breaking change, we're moving an API, changing the behavior of something, developers are never surprised and hopefully also never hurt by the removal. So one of the pieces of this is that we want to make sure that when we remove something, there is another way to achieve the use cases that developers were sort of relying on this current API that we're breaking for said use case.
Hey, I realized you didn't put the, do you want to talk with the elastic band analogy? I think it's a great analogy, and I don't think we've talked about it outside Chrome.
So an analogy that we use a lot on Chrome is the elastic band of the web. Many of you may have heard of this before, but the idea is you can sort of think of the web as the 4 or 5 billion web platform implementations being held together by a rubber band. And that rubber band represents the actual web, right? And the reason it's a rubber band is because there is room to stretch. One browser can go out in a certain direction. They can try a new API. And then over time, that elastic band exerts a pressure, right? The fact that one of the browsers is out on its own either pulls the other browsers towards it, if it's a good idea, or pulls the browser back into the fold if it's a bad idea. The other piece of the elastic band is if you stretch too far, it can break. And so that is sort of ultimate failure on the web platform team, at least for Chrome, is if any browser pushes too hard in one direction or holds back too aggressively, such that the elastic breaks and we now have a situation where developers can no longer target the web as a whole. They have maybe like a couple browsers that are similar and then one that's so different that they target that one specifically. Right? And so a lot of the work we do on the predictability team is trying to turn this fuzzy concept of the elastic band into something more objective that we can measure. And so a lot of times you'll hear us mentioning the elastic band in terms of like, oh, we want to measure the elastic band, we want to visualize the elastic band. But that is an analogy we commonly use to think about how we handle that.
And we fully admit that we might, it's sometimes a little painful to talk about, but we fully admit that we've made mistakes that have caused too much tension in the elastic band, right? So Knackle is probably one that we can all admit now is a mistake. And there's plenty of others, and our goal is not to create any tension, but to be smart about the tension that we create. We think web components, for example, we definitely created tension there. There's things we could have done better, but we think that some of that tension was probably good for the web. Service workers, we probably created tension. And we can debate, and I love debating with Mozilla folks because they're tend to be respectful, but also critical of, was it really, it's a great question if maybe we should always wait for there to be 2 implementations before shipping anything. Maybe what's best for the web. Like we should be free to have that dialogue. And we see it as kind of our job to help supply some data to that dialogue and try to quantify what tension is good tension, what tension is bad tension. Does anyone have feedback or comments on any of that? Because this is intended to be a bit of a discussion. Not
Does
just
this long-term vision make anybody scared or happy? Or
do you think the number of, like, say this is like a long-term vision, right now there's like not too many players in like the browser space that are big. Like, how do you think this would change if we had like somehow, like, because right now building a browser is like a huge ordeal. What if like someday it was to the point where there was many other major browsers, and like kind of like how like you develop for different platforms, like you develop for different web browsers.
Right.
How do you think this would like change or stay the same if we had like 100 different players instead of 5?
I think, at least the way I view it, and of course anyone's welcome to jump in. I think the first bullet, and the way it's phrased, is very carefully trying to make way for this possibility, which is that we don't want all the platforms to be homogeneous in terms of their capabilities, in terms of sort of what paradigms or primitives they expose. But the main goal is that when you are working with the same capability on multiple browsers, you can work with it in the same ways. And so I think in a future like that, right, if there were, say, 100 browsers, one of the big differences that would come up is you would imagine that the sort of range of capabilities that could be available becomes so large that we probably need to add some kind of primitive to make it easier to reason about what capabilities are exposed to you. It sounds like a great option for the feature control team to think about.
I think maybe one way it could be like, if there's 5 players, it sort of makes sense if we have like a 2D rubber band. But if there's like 100, it makes more sense if we have like a 100-dimensional rubber band.
Right. You're inside of a
You can go, yeah.
one of those rubber band balls.
Yeah.
We've debated this question a bunch amongst the web platform leads. Like even like frankly, just talking about, you know, like when Presto folded, right? Is that good or bad for the web, right? And there's a lot of legitimate interest in debate here. I don't think anybody has any answers, but I think most people in the space agree that there is a continuum and the extremes are probably bad. Having a single popular engine for the web is bad for the web. Probably having 2, and probably even if there's only 3, that's probably too few, right? 100 is probably too many.
Yeah.
Like, there's always going to be differences in implementation, and it's not about the browsers, it's really about the engine implementation, right? Like all the different derivatives of Chromium we consider to be mostly good as long as they're actually keeping up to date, not forking, right? You know, so I personally think 100 is probably way too many. It's probably going to cause more pain for the ecosystem than it's going to help, but it's really hard to say what the right number is. You know, like it kind of feels like maybe it's somewhere between 4 and 10 or something. I don't know.
And 100 isn't too wrong if you look at all the versions that are still out there, like 42 breaking search. Like it is 100 eventually because
keep each
are
version.
updated.
Yeah,
More than 100. We keep track of more than 100 different stuff.
Yeah,
for sure.
So it's kind of about breaking your future self in some way, right?
One thing that kind of interesting from your analogy is like what controls the elasticity of that band. Like part of it is like market forces and kind of developers, but part of it is also how easy it is to implement the feature. For example, if there was a way so that different browser could share some core code, make it easier. So writing more tests definitely helps, but maybe we could write features in JavaScript. Maybe I could grab a feature and just port it over.
Yeah, I mean, you think that like the diversity of C++ compilers, right? The fact that many of them share the same STL code or something like that is like, it's not crazy. We talked before about maybe every other major computing platform is divided into a kernel and a standard library. You know, maybe the web should really have a standard library for the web, and maybe that's an open source project with different.
Mike, you've been about to jump in.
Well, I was the first point, like that's something that like people have talked about this since, you know, the early days, like unobtrusive JavaScript. I think that was the term. I think that's the ideal, but I'm interested to see what that manifests as, because there's so many different use cases for user agent sniffing, right? It's not just about like, oh, we don't have the time to fix your bugs. It's like people want to do, we need to know like the very precise DPI, but it's not provided by that device manufacturer, or they're using like a proxy browser. There's all these like weird business use cases. So I think I'm interested to see what that turns into, or how it deals with that beyond just like feature detection, right?
One of the things we've talked about in the main problem with UA sniffing is not necessarily that your user agent sniffing, but that it is very brittle, right? As things within a browser change, UA sniffing doesn't update to it. So another potential solution here is making UA sniffing something that's not as brittle, right? So that you could special case on a browser, and then as that special case goes away, you automatically, your code automatically updates. But that is, ideas in that space are still very, we have no idea what we would do.
I think this is like our North Star. Like this is a vision that we'd like to try to move towards. I don't think anyone expects to actually get there. But one of the things that keeps, when I think about UA sniffing, I keep being reminded, has anyone read Tim Wu's The Master Switch? That's like a manifesto for me, and all this predictability stuff. It's all about openness. You should totally read it. Everyone here should care about it. But one of the core statements in there is that the key determiner of how open an ecosystem is the barrier to entry. If you want to be a new cell provider, there's a huge barrier to entry, right? And so it's not a very open ecosystem. And the more websites rely on UA sniffing, we've seen in practice, talk to the Edge team about what it took to ship Edge, right? All the UA sniffing and trying to figure out what should their UA string be acted as a real barrier to entry to a new browser entry. And I think that's bad for the web. So like UA sniffing isn't inherently evil, but having a high barrier to entry to new engines to me is bad for openness.
I think from my perspective in UA sniffing, because we do a lot of this, we're just as guilty as anyone else on search of UA sniffing, is that it's not, we don't hate the process of UA sniffing so much as we hate the UA string itself. Like the mapping of a UA string to a set of features that a browser supports is a very weird sort of transformation. So if the UA was more closely aligned with what the browser actually supported and more explicit, it'd be much easier for a new browser to come online. If they just said, oh, we support this spec, this spec, this spec, rather than we're sort of like Gecko, but also sort of not, and that's really hard for us.
We brainstormed. You could imagine some server type, some infrastructure that provides a database that lets you like query and say, what's the right regex to tell me what browsers support this feature or pass this test? And then like somebody like Search could use that at build time, so that every time they rebuild Search, they've got the exact right, UA string, and that can be updated, right? And there's a bunch of potential things we could do here too.
It's also important to realize that users will configure their browsers and disable certain features or enable experimental ones. So it's not just something that should be solved with a simple string, but with a feature protection system and all the privacy implications. So of course, Mozilla employees will be happy to discuss too. So. What is semi-collides this trend in JavaScript and build tools where people want to build like the perfect app version for this device, right? Only serve like the minimal JavaScript that's needed to render like the low-fi version on a low-end phone, the high-fi version on a high-end phone, the minimal data version on a phone that doesn't have enough connectivity, so kind of serving or optimizing a build for that phone, which then of course either depends on client hints or still UA sniffing, so that's where you figured out how to make it possible to optimize for that device experience. How about a clean break from user agent strings and just having new sets of headers and sunset each browser sunsets the UA string so that sites that need it currently can use it, but future sites or sites that are willing to change can use a better system instead. That's another possibility that needs to really be explored.
Isn't that break like every single website ever?
No, because basically the browser will be committing to supporting what their user agent string currently says for backwards compatibility for old sites. But new sites using proper new feature detection and HTTP headers or whatever you decide would have a better system.
Everybody stops at 65.
Yeah, Chrome would start, Link would stop with whatever user agent string they want to stop with. That'll freeze for backwards compatibility until they're no longer concerned with it. And ditto for other vendors. They'll have their own UA string that they sell down kind of a compatible with Firefox 46 or compatible with Chrome 65 UA. That's not going to change anything because it's too limited or problematic.
All right, jump to the next slide. Of course, we can always continue discussions. We've got the rest of the day. So within the realm of interop, so Chrome sort of splits the predictability problem into compat, which is not breaking sites that exist, and then interop, which is being conform with other browsers and specs. Our main goals in this are to sort of create that engineering discipline that Rick was mentioning before, right? So figuring out what tooling and best practices we should adopt as an ecosystem so that everyone can sort of ensure that as they're building a new feature, sort of moving forward, they're doing it responsibly. Then also making it easier to reason about interop compared to some of the more concrete feature work, right? Like one problem we get a lot is that it's very easy to launch a feature and see what usage it gets, or to see, what businesses adopt it. It's really hard to reason about what kind of metrics you can put on your performance packet or in your review with higher ups about improving interop. So trying to make it easier for teams to quantify that and balance it against their other work. And then also trying to make sure that specs as we move forward and implementations are sort of doing it from a conformant way from the beginning, right? So that specs have tests, browsers look at those tests when they implement, trying to make it less sort of wishy-washy or sort of backwards or reverse engineering when the second browser comes along to implement. These are sort of our main goals that we'd like to see sort of push forward right now, rather than necessarily fixing any specific interop issues at this moment. It's more, how can we get the long-term arc right, and then start fixing some of these interop issues. If anyone wants to discuss. So for that goal, we have sort of a set of.
I just want to throw something out. I don't understand everyone's team description, but it would be really great to hear from folks from Mozilla and Boku about how, what they think tools that would help with this middle point should look like. That's one of the things that I'm working on. Is like what tools help you answer questions that you ask when you're trying to prioritize working on interoperability and driving forward with new features. Because we're definitely interested in investing in tools that will help all browser vendors do that job better.
Does anyone have any immediate thoughts there?
I was just going to say things like telemetry. You already have probably the best world-class set of how many pages are using WebKit prefix this, to do that. That sort of thing really helps. And obviously, among all those web platform tests and making sure that all the old CSS tests and whatever are migrated, so we have a common ground to work with, would also be helpful. As far as decisions, though, I can't speak for too many people in Mozilla myself because I'm on the fringe of the development side, but just getting in touch with people, having an open avenue, a public forum for people to deal with this sort of thing would probably be the most beneficial because it's very diverse right now how we deal with these things.
Yeah, we should say we didn't put a link in the slides, but we do have a platform-predictability at chromium.org list where we talked about a bunch of the stuff. There's maybe not a good reason for it to be on chromium.org. It could be elsewhere. I know Mike and David Burners, others have chimed in there. I've talked with, say, Servo folks who wanted to use our telemetry data to help prioritize there, right? So we've done work to help them do that. We're totally open to collaborating on that. We've got some restrictions, like we're really concerned about user privacy. So I love how Firefox has much more of their data is openly open. We do our best to expose the data we can. Like there's a bunch of stuff that needs Google access to get. So we can always work with you to do that.
One thing I was going to say, I've been trying to think about this forever, and I never come to a satisfying answer. It's like what are your metrics? What could you write an OKR against for interoperability? You could say do this thing as well as Chrome, and you can kind of loosely define that, but it's so hard to understand what that even means. Boaz was talking about this web platform test dashboard and
yeah, so we're not implementing, so we don't have this kind of backlog, but we are working on tools to support you all. Yeah, I think the test results could be data that's fed as an input into prioritizing a backlog. If every browser is reporting into the same space, then we could use that as a vector for priority. Yeah. And if you did that alongside telemetry for what features are being used or not working. This is what we were talking about in the car.
What was really interesting, so we were talking about how do we prioritize, okay, this is the bug that needs to get fixed, and sometimes it's just like a gut feeling. Other times, like, okay, we know we have this many dupe bugs, you know, it's breaking this many sites, et cetera. That's a signal. But Boaz was mentioning like a way to see it easily, like, okay, X% of web users have access to this feature based on market share, like which browsers pass these tests. And you can see, like, show me all the features where we are like really hurting our users. Some kind of visualization like that, I think, would be really interesting.
Or just even a metric.
Right.
If you can visualize that metric, like an algorithm for just computing, for weighting these various inputs and saying, this is important.
Yeah, Drew's gonna get some of the things we're working on there. It's still pretty primitive, but we're trying to at least start with something simple.
The idea of correlating with usage numbers, I think we've mentioned a couple times, even just this week, as I've been digging into some of the data we've been generating. Like, wouldn't it be cool if we could cross this with sort of like how many pages in the wild use it? It's certainly very hard, but I think that would be sort of the ultimate canon for a lot of this, right?
I mean, it seems like we're able for like, you know, advertising and behavior tracking of consumers to like retarget across like very complex journeys. So it seems like it's possible to do that.
I think privacy and like the open web, closed web is one of the biggest concerns in this like usage space, is that we get these really biased samples if we just go to the open web, right? Like a lot of APIs are only used in places where you can log in, and then that API becomes useful for peer-to-peer connections or whatever. And so it's challenging in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons is to get by a lot of those biases where it's, you know, if we just tried to crawl the web, right, we would only get anything that's outside of paywall, outside of login screen, et cetera. But if we could get somehow actual sort of user data as, you know, users are browsing, sort of triggering like what web platform tests they're hitting, things like that. The question there is, how do we sort of responsibly integrate that sort of metrics analysis in a way that's both privacy sensitive, but also doesn't hurt the performance of the browser, right? If you say every user runs web platform tests, entire repo every time they boot up to see, like, oh, is it on this? That would be honestly very extreme.
Oh, wow.
Another angle to approach this from is to have a very centralized location for users to ask quirks and compatibility and other types of issues, so that everybody on all the teams will have a webcompat.com, for, you know, lack of a better term for it. But it would be an actual place where you could not just submit, okay, this site doesn't work on this browser, works on this one, but for a CSS developer to come in and say, this works here, this doesn't work here, what do I do? For all of us to have our eyes in one spot to see these things as they come in.
Yeah, I think that's really frustrating for web developers when, like, they don't know, like, to them, there's a bug in the web platform, right? And then, but if they file a bug on a browser, everybody just points fingers,
Exactly.
right? And if you think of software engineering discipline for the web platform as a whole, well, of course you need a single bug tracker for a product. It's software engineering discipline.
And on top of that, with like we were just discussing, having paywalls and NDAs and things like that, developers are more apt to be able to say, I tried this little CSS fragment, it doesn't work, and help us produce test cases to turn into web platform tests or whatever we need. If we give them with open arms a place to say, well, all the browser vendor, you know, engine gurus are looking at this, you know, bug tracker, whatever you want to call it, and collaborating on it, it might actually, going forward, help resolve a lot of the long-standing work and compatibility issues that aren't quite properly spec'd out yet.
Right. So within our sort of goals for interop, we have a series of phased plans that we think is a set of good steps towards achieving those. So a lot of it starts within Chrome. So you see sort of the first two bullet points are get our own house in order. So a lot of this is getting web platform tests to be automatically integrated into our CI, automatically importing, exporting, changing the team culture to leverage web platform tests, and then also making it so that we can visualize interop in a way that helps drive decisions for Chrome. So this is one of our hypotheses here, is that we don't want to make big grandiose claims about, like, this is the new metric for interop, and then have everybody point out all the reasons why that's very silly. So we want to see, let's just iterate a little bit for Chrome and see if we can come up with numbers that lead to useful results, right? If we generate this data and we start trying to act on it, does it lead to positive results? Things like that. And then once we feel like we've got something that's working for us, we want to then start turning towards, encouraging others to adopt similar tools or similar processes, looking at similar numbers and metrics. And of course, throughout all this, we're making sure that the work we're doing is open. So if anyone wants to jump in early, they can. But we don't want to make the mistake of pushing too hard before we've really figured out a lot of these things. And, sort of sour people on working in this space. So once we have things sort of in order ourselves, we feel like we do, we want to then work on increasing usage of some of these tools within standards, right? So standards come with tests and conformance suites. And then also work with other browsers to see if there's anything we can do to help getting them to adopt a platform test, right? We were sort of encouraged by seeing how much Mozilla was already doing in this space. Hopefully we can help to be a similar example for other browsers and helping them move forward in that way. And then once all the browsers, all the specs are all kind of using all this tooling, it feels like it's really gelling, trying to then create some sort of broader effort across the web to track a lot of these metrics, to find and fix a lot of these interop issues, sort of start treating the web platform like a whole rather than a series of competing implementations would be sort of our ultimate end step, if we could ever get there.
And in particular, this is why, like, working with people like Tom and talking about the pain they're feeling, like, I still feel like it's easy for us in the browser engine community to, like, point fingers at web developers saying, like, oh, why are you making stuff hard for Firefox or whatever browser? But I think we have a lot to do. If you think of it from the perspective of a web developer, as they're targeting the web platform as one product, we have a ton to do to get our own house in order, I think. And there's a ton of low-hanging fruit, because everybody wants to do it. Even, like, when we've done web platform test meetups in the past, all the major engines are really excited about it. So I'm optimistic that we have a huge opportunity to get our house in order in terms of engineering the web as a whole, and then showing web developers, look what we've done. Look how increasingly, we've got the data that shows increasingly you can just target the web. And then that's when I think it makes sense to have like a real effort of doing more to shift the culture of web development to be, reduce the reliance on UA sniffing and that sort of thing. So within Google, so I'm really happy we've got Tom and the search team like partnering with us to help try to figure some of this out. But we're not like aggressively going after every single Google team and saying, let's work with you, to get your site working much better on Firefox, right? I think it's much more scalable to say, let's solve our problems so that we can go to those teams and say, look, your site already works on Firefox if it pretends to be Chrome. And that's not, that doesn't mean just changing Firefox, right? Sometimes that's going to mean, and we've done this in the past, making a change in Chrome that breaks Google properties, right? Like we broke mobile Gmail. So we were doing something on standard that mobile Gmail relied on. So the solution to fix Firefox was, we're going to break Gmail. Like it was unmaintained, there was nobody here to fix it, but we're like, well, we're going to break it anyway. And then we'll find somebody to fix it.
So our current areas of focus, this is kind of the main things we think are the tractable problems in interop right now. And this is also really quickly not to suggest that other teams on Chrome aren't working on specific interop issues. This is more for the predictability effort more broadly. The big one is this, Rick used this example last night, and so I updated my slides. The interop ratchet, so this idea that as a ratchet moves in one direction, not the other. So if we can get to a point where any time we fix something for interop or any time we make some improvement, it gets locked in, and such that interop is sort of a monotonically increasing function on the web, or as close to it as we can get. That would be obviously very powerful and make any future efforts strictly additive. So that's one of the big areas we're working on now, and a lot of this is in our investments in web platform tests and getting it so that interop or potential interop differences are immediately captured in a place that all the browsers can see and can measure and hopefully never regress on again. The next piece is in interop visualization. So we've mentioned this a couple times. We have a few projects that we're trying to just get more data on this, and I'll jump in on the next slide. I have some of the active projects we're working on. I'll jump into that a bit more. But the main goal here is to help sort of shine light on areas that maybe people didn't realize are sort of problem areas, and then giving people tools to say, oh, okay, so we could work on a new feature, or we could fix this interop debt. What's the relative weight between those two? how bad are we, how in each case, and what could we be doing. And then for specific interop fixes, our main focus right now is partnering with larger web properties to find what are the interop problems that are affecting them. So this is sort of bootstrapping this idea of weighting web platform tests or interop issues by usage. We just say, let's go to sites we know have high usage, fix their interop issues, and so sort of like driving down that list initially.
The other thing I would add here that isn't really, it's not directly the focus of what we've been doing here, but related to this is over the past year and a half or so, the web platform team has really created a lot of discipline around just bug discipline and bug health. And so the biggest thing that when I go to Chrome Dev Summit and talk to random web developers, the biggest thing I hear now is when they file a bug against us saying, hey, my site's broken because of this difference in browsers, or we talk a lot about regressions, right? They get pissed off when someone changes Chrome, right? That has we've made huge strides in that. Now, so in addition to these things that we're actively driving, we've also, I think, succeeded in really shifting the culture on the Blink team such that a lot of great interop work happens distributed across the team as a natural outgrowth of people filing bugs against us.
So I think that sort of a pair to this slide is the things we're actively working on right now. So I'm giving a link to the ecosystem infra team OKRs, which are public, so anyone can take a look at that. I think even leave comments if you want. Keep in mind we're into Q3, so we may not be able to change them, but it'd be useful to hear for Q4.
And keep in mind, Google OKRs are intentionally aggressive. We will not achieve 100% of. If we do, we fail to be aggressive enough. So they're not commitments.
So the big things we're working on, obviously automatic import, export of web platform tests into Chrome. And then we're also trying, working with Boku to sort of fund some improvements to the actual general public contribution workflow for web platform tests. I'm working on a PR tool that will help show sort of the results of your PR in all the major browsers. We're working on the dashboard, which we'll get to in a moment. We're just trying to make that process easier and easier. We're also trying to increase the number of tests that you can automate in web platform tests. So one of the big limiting factors in what at least Google teams will say, or Chrome teams will say, why they do or don't contribute web platform tests. They say, oh, well, we need to automate this thing, and we can only do a manual test in web platform tests. So trying to find those biggest areas of lacking automation and add capabilities there. We're also working to get more specs writing tests in pair, in unison with their the standardization efforts, and we're improving Chrome driver as much as we can. Then on the other piece, we have two areas where we've been working on interop visualization. So one is just having a dashboard to show web platform test health and visualizing that per directory. The other one, which Mark has been working on, is our API confluence metrics. And what this is right now is we sort of crawl the JavaScript object graph in each browser and report sort of what APIs are available. And then we do that historically across every browser version we can get our hands on. There's some like Edge, it's kind of hard because the version is tied to the Windows version. So we haven't fully filled out our data pipeline yet with versions, but this week I've actually been digging into some of that data, and already we're getting really interesting results. So we've been trying to look at how many APIs does each browser ship where no one else had implemented it before, and then of those, what percentage eventually had a second, third, or fourth implementation. On average, how long does it take to get to that second implementation, so we can start reasoning about, oh, this API is taking 1.5 years, and that's getting kind of long. Maybe we should start talking about sunsetting it or doing more concerted outreach. So this one is still very much under development to see what kind of insights we can glean from that. We have a few guesses here and there, and we can obviously talk about that more later. But these are sort of the two main areas, right? Web platform test infrastructure improvements and better visualizations. Not pictured here is a lot of other work, like Danielle and Ali have been working on contributions WebKit and sort of like building bridges there, figuring out how we can make that more uniform. Obviously, this collaboration is not listed here, but it's something we're working on. So there's lots of other little pieces here and there. I think this is my last slide. So if there's anything folks wanted to additionally discuss here, I think we've taken longer than 30 minutes, so we can also jump into the next presentation if we'd like.
Is there any follow-up on that? Yes, that is it. So
You want to see this?
next thing.
WPT.FYI, you should check it out. So it's still under development, but you want to see how the HTML tests are doing across different browsers, right? We're trying to strike a balance here. We don't want this to be gamified necessarily, but to at least be able to say, what's the current status of individual tests. We've got kind of current stable releases of all the major browsers, or not stable. Chrome and Firefox we use Chrome Dev Channel and Firefox. I forget. Anyway, 56, I guess. So
Quick question. How are we dealing, or in general, not just we in this room, with the coverage of platform tests with respect to their specs, so that we know how much of the spec as written currently is being covered? Is there any effort that you guys are aware of in that regard, or do you need to?
there's no concerted effort that I'm aware of. There's no coherent effort, but there are efforts in individual areas. So for example, we've been working with Boku on the WebRTC spec, especially because we know Safari is actually shipping that right now, right?
One of the issues is the spec, the TR format doesn't allow you to, we can't necessarily automatically do a coverage analysis, and link between the tests. And so we've also been thinking about potential new formats for TRs to link with tests and be able to do that kind of analysis.
Rick Waldron did a really thorough analysis,
He
went
has-
line by line by the WebRTC spec, and basically just working, checking them off as they were tested.
And made a new version of the spec where he does coverage analysis manually in it. And then we've showed that to Philippe Lahegre at the W3C, and they're thinking about a new version of the design for the TR for next year. So.
And then there's some APIs like, I think it's the Streams API, which has our JavaScript reference implementation, and then they explicitly run the web platform test to do a code coverage analysis over the reference implementation.
I was going to say another option would be crowdsourcing too, because I'm sure there are quite a few site authors and vendors of different sites in the business world that would like to have their own tests. So if they could actually be able to not just submit a web platform test, but link what part of the spec they're testing against, or what corner case the spec doesn't cover.
This would be an implementer or a consumer?
Just if let's pretend it's a public effort, crowdsourced. So to let people basically say, I just want this to be covered, I'm going to write a web platform test for it. It refers to this line in this spec document. I don't see it in the tests right now. Or this is something the spec doesn't cover, here's a test for it. We'd like to find out if this is something the spec should be more coherent on.
I think there's a big jump between I want to use WebRTC and I'm going to read the spec. But there are the mental model for how the tests are organized is by implementer and not by user. And so there's, which I was going to bring up when you were talking about feature detection in general. It's a very interesting topic for the feature control team. I think it's somewhere over there. Hi.
Yeah, and this was kind of tried with Test Web Forward, right? The W3C effort. I'm personally kind of I love the idea of it being open, and it's absolutely we've had some very sophisticated web developers submit some great web platform tests, but I'm honestly kind of pessimistic about that being scalable. I want to get to the point where it's just a natural part of every browser engineer's workflow that they're submitting web platform tests, because they're the ones that have to read the spec and understand it.
That's fine. Then even if we just omit the crowdsourcing aspect of it, the public idea, that's okay with me. But do we definitely have a way for them to quote each tests in a specific version?
I mean, we generally do it in comments today. It's not. The CSS working group had an explicit way of doing it, but it was hard to maintain. I think we're talking about how could we do this explicitly, but certainly when you write a pull request, you say, here's the part of the spec I'm testing.
Yeah, I just want to see if we have any ideas on formalism. So that's easier to. When a spec is changed, say this is obsoleting these web platform tests, or we now need tests for these cases.
Yeah. So for example, I was just about to show you a demo of the thing Boku just did, but I just submitted this web platform test that where some APIs were removed from the spec. So my comment says remove, here's where it's removed and whatnot. And then this is the new, we've had results in here before, but Bob just kind of got this new results dashboard online where you can see, I added these tests in particular because Chrome doesn't ship these APIs. They were removed from the spec, but and we're going to work on this UI to kind of make it more useful. But Firefox does ship the APIs, so it should have test failures now, saying that you failed the test because you're shipping an API that's not spec.
That's the automation.
Also, if you go to if you go to the root here, you can list all the pull requests that are open. It's another way to navigate it. This is just live like yesterday.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, this is awesome.
Very cool.
All right, sorry, I know Drew was trying to actually keep us somewhat on time. I made that work.
So at this point, it is 12. I think there's two paths we could take. We could try and power through the presentation from Mozilla and then go get